Welcome to the Inside Scoop Live podcast, where indie authors get personal about their books, their writing, and their passions. I'm your host, Sherry Hoyt. Join me for some lively conversations with debut indie authors and seasoned veterans alike. It's a great place to find your next amazing read or even get inspired. So sit back and enjoy the show and let me know what you think. Hi, everyone. Joining me today is Sepehr Haddad, author of The Harmless Necessary Cat, a story that illuminates Iran's lesser-known experiences during World War II through a poignant tale of love, loss, and resilience. Before we get started, here's the inside scoop on the author. Sepehr Haddad is the author of 2 acclaimed novels. His latest release, The Harmless Necessary Cat, became a #1 Amazon bestseller in the History of Iran category and earned the prestigious HFC EM Forster Gold Medal. His debut novel, 100 Sweet Promises, won the 2023 American Fiction Awards for historical fiction and historical romance, and was a #1 Amazon bestseller in Middle Eastern literature and historical Russian fiction. Beyond writing, Sepehr is also a Universal Music Group recording artist and part of the Billboard chart-topping duo Shaheen and Sepehr. To learn more about Sepehr Haddad and his work, visit his website at sepehrhaddad.com. Well, good morning, Sepehr. Welcome to Inside Scoop Live.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you.
Tell us about your book, The Harmless Necessary Cat, and what inspired you to write this story?
Well, my first book was called 100 Sweet Promises, and that was a book about my grandfather's life. He went to Russia and studied music there. And it was more of a family saga romance story. For the second book, I was really trying to think of what I'd like to write about. Iran, of course, is a topic dear to my heart. You know, my parents are Iranian. I am an Iranian American. I was born here in Washington, D.C., but as a child, we moved back to Iran. And so my formative years were spent in Iran. And so I wanted to write a topic, again, that involved Iran. And around that time, my father passed away, so we had to go and clean out his condo. And when we did that, I found 10 cassette tapes that he had recorded where he wanted to write his memoirs in a book. And I started listening to those, especially because it was right after he passed away. So it was very soothing to listen to those tapes. It was like I had my father back talking to me.
Yeah.
But he had described all of these interesting little stories that had happened to him during World War II, his growing up in Iran and moving into World War II, and then his leaving Iran to come to the States to study in 1947 after the war. And so The Harmless Necessary Cat, my new novel, is basically separated into 3 sections. One is the pre-war years, the war years, and the post-war years. And so the pre-war years stories are really my father's stories. And so even though this is a historical fiction book, it really has a lot of fact in it. It's very close to the other extreme of, you know, where historical fiction, you can go all the way from totally fiction made up to actually very close to fact. And this is one of those. And I decided to then write about what happened to Iran in World War II. And so that's why I wrote this whole book, starting out with my father's kind of memoirs and stories of a book he never was able to release. And that also had some joy for me because he always wanted to write a book. He never got to do it. And then I dedicated the book to him.
Oh, wow. What a treasure to find those tapes. Oh, my gosh. I bet you weren't expecting that at all.
No, I wasn't. And the stories were, I heard stuff I did not know. My father hadn't even told me directly.
That is so wonderful. And what a basis for a book. Excuse me.
You.
Now, the title, there's a little nod to Shakespeare in the title.
Yes.
How did this phrase connect to your story?
So that's a very good point. The Harmless Necessary Cat, and you're very astute to notice that. A lot of people don't know where that term came from. And that is basically from The Merchant of Venice. It's actually Act 4 of The Merchant of Venice, where Shylock, for people who know that story or play, is a moneylender, and he's trying to defend himself at some point. And he compares himself to a harmless, necessary cat that's just sitting there catching the mice, not bothering anybody. And he's comparing himself to that, defending himself.
Hmm.
And so in 1907, the British magazine, which was a cartoon type magazine, it's kind of like the New Yorker of today,
Yeah.
called The Harmless Necessary Cat. So the person who drew this cartoon took that title from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice because Iran is kind of geographically shaped like the head of a cat, the top of Iran, and also
Oh.
because of the Persian cat that's so famous. And in this cartoon that they were lampooning basically Iran, it's a cat sitting between the Russian bear and a British lion. And the Russian bear is stroking the cat's head while the British lion is holding his tail. And the Russian tells the British, see, I can hold his head, you can hold his tail, and we can both kind of stroke the small of his back. And the Persian cat has this look of fear on his face, and he's saying, how come nobody consulted me about this?
Yeah.
And so this was this thing called the Great Game between Russia and Britain back then, where they decided to divide Iran into two spheres of influence and basically created a semi-colonial state where Iran, of course, was an independent state, has always been independent, never was colonized, but it was occupied during World War II.
Hmm.
And that's why I chose that title,
Hmm.
because in World War II, the Russians and the British invade Iran that was a neutral country, just for their own interests and benefits. Of course, saying that they're doing it to protect the world from the German war machine and all that, but really it was more to get access to Iranian oil and to get access to transportation through the Trans-Iranian Railway, which would allow the British to ship supplies to the Russians from the Persian Gulf to Russia, which is north of Iran.
Very creative. I love that.
Thank you.
It's fun too. It's kind of
Yes,
it's a title that will draw readers in, I believe,
I
What's
hope
that
so.
about? Yeah. The story setting in Tehran during World War II, it's unique. It's, at least from what I've seen, it's a rarely explored angle in historical fiction. Was that part of your goal to bring attention to this chapter of
Yeah,
history?
yes, exactly. Because, especially here in the West, whenever we watch World War II movies, it's either the Allies defeating the Japanese or the Allies defeating the Germans or, to a lesser extent, the Italians.
Hmm.
And we always see it from the perspective of, the Allies. And so usually the Japanese and Germans and anybody who's against the Allies is portrayed really villainous. They just look like villains, and they're going to do all kinds of terrible things.
Hmm.
And I wanted to show that in war, even the side you're on can do terrible things. And so, of course, I'm happy that the West won that war. But during that war, a lot of things happened that the Allies should not be proud of.
Hmm.
And one of them was invading a neutral country like Iran, and then not only invading and occupying it, but then diverting all the food harvest so the Russian soldiers wouldn't go hungry, while Iranians starved and many died of starvation related diseases.
Oh, wow. I love that point you bring up though about just because you're on that side doesn't make it right, and doesn't just
Right,
because they're an ally doesn't make them good.
exactly. I think
Now,
Clint Eastwood had done something similar with letters from Iwo Jima, where
mm,
he had found some letters that the Japanese soldiers had sent or written back home or between them, families and that. And they were talking about, their life and how they saw everything. And he wrote a film from the Japanese perspective. Also, there was a film called Das Boot. I don't know if you remember that. It was
yes,
about a
I
German submarine.
yeah.
So the German U-boats are trying to attack Allied ships, but you get so engulfed in the feelings of these U-boat Germans that you kind of don't want them to get captured or killed,
Mm,
even though they're trying to attack Allied ships. So it's a very interesting dynamic.
right, right, absolutely, yeah. Um, Now I know you have a cultural background that influenced the story and your approach to writing the book, but what was your level of research? And in that research, was there anything that surprised you or
Oh
impacted
yes,
you?
yes. That's and as writers, you know how it is that it's the research that's really one of the most fun parts of doing it, because then the writing part is very hard and then the marketing part is hard.
Yeah.
So the research part is the easiest and the most interesting, because I found out so many things. For example, first of all, since I lived in Iran, it was very easy for me to write about Tehran and these other cities that I write about, like Rasht and Ghazvin, because I've gone to all these cities in Iran and visited. And so I knew it quite well. And so when I was writing these scenes, I was actually imagining myself in those areas and those streets and those squares that I talk about and everything. And so there was a familiarity there that even library research or online research would not have allowed me to write it like that. It had to be
Right.
more from a personal experience. But the interesting things I found out, well, number one, the thing that shocked me the most of all the research that I did was that some researchers say 4 million Iranian died in World War II.
Mm.
And the population of Iran at the time was 16 million. So a quarter of the population of a country died because of an imposed war that a neutral country didn't want to be involved in.
And they were neutral. Wow.
They were neutral. They didn't want anything to do with it. And the Allies kept saying, you have a lot of German citizens in your country, you got to expel them. And the Iranian king at the time, Reza Shah, was saying, we have a lot of expatriate Germans here because they're helping build our country. They were building the railway system, they were building hospitals, roads, bridges, telecommunications, the whole thing. And Reza Shah was saying, they have nothing to do with the Nazis. These are people that have just come here to help us.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was even more difficult for him to see why the Allies are trying to get rid of them when they had really not done anything to us. Now, they sensed that Reza Shah had some leanings towards the Germans, but not towards Nazi Germany, but basically towards the Germans, because that was the only counterbalance he could see to put off the Russian and British long-held interests in Iran. He wanted
Right.
something to counterbalance that. And Iran had no allies at the time. So Germany was the closest type of a country that was fighting their enemies. And so that's why the Russian and British were very nervous about that relationship.
Yeah.
So that was the most kind of shocking thing that I read, that a quarter of the population died. And we're just talking little less than 100 years ago.
Yeah. I'm kind of speechless, I guess, because it's like, wow, these people were neutral and you
Right.
took a quarter of their population. That's, oh,
And other things that were very interesting for me were then some of the research I did, I was able to get access to, you know, how we have the Freedom of Information Act here, where after a certain while, documents that are deemed to be like security type documents, they can then be released 50 years or 70 years after an event has happened.
right.
And we can learn what people were saying or doing. And so in this, I was able to go into some of the British archives and some of the Russian archives. And one of the very interesting things is that in 1943, the Allies, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, decided to have a meeting, one of their first meetings of the three major meetings they had, Potsdam and Yalta, the others, where they were going to decide the future of Europe, basically, after the war was over. And so Tehran was the place they chose, and that was surprising to me. Why would they want to meet in Tehran? Well, the reason they did, and I read this in the Soviet archives, was that Stalin was afraid to fly. And so he wanted to go someplace close by where he could take the train. And there was
Oh,
a train in Baku, Azerbaijan, which was a Soviet Socialist Republic at the time, which was very close to the northern border of Iran. And that way, Stalin could come by train to Tehran and not be that far away from Russia. So that was very interesting to me to see what had happened during that time. And the meetings were held in the Russian embassy because the Russians had an inkling that the Germans are going to try to do something like attack the Allies or whatever. And so that's in my book also. I don't want to give it all away, but
right.
what was going to happen with the Allies. And the Germans were hoping to basically make the Allies headless if they could attack them and get rid of them in Tehran.
Oh, wow. I love the research part. I mean, it's so fascinating, but I can see myself just going down different rabbit holes and just never getting a book written, you know?
Right, right. That's what was happening to me. I kept on doing more research, thinking this could be it's a 300-page book, but I thought it easily could have been a 500-page book. But I just didn't want to write a book that long. I don't like reading books that long. So,
Right. Right.
but,
Good choice. Because you can always write a sequel
right,
or, yeah.
exactly.
Right. So, well, let's talk about some of your characters. Now, your protagonist, Sorab,
Yes.
goes through an incredible journey in the story. Tell us a little bit about him and what you hope readers connect with most about him.
Well, so Rob, again, I said in the beginning that the story was kind of the pre-war years were really my dad's story.
Hmm.
So he grows up in a family where his father is very forward-thinking and loves American ideals, the Jeffersonian ideals of freedom of speech and press and these type of things. Is very upset that the Russian and the British are basically always playing with his country, always trying to take advantage of the country. He's always warning Sorab, his son, that this is what they plan to do. If they cannot control our leaders, then they'll create a war to control the country. And
Mm-hmm.
it turns out that he was very prescient that it actually did happen. And so that is Sorab. And so Sorab grows up very nationalistic, very, feeling great about being Iranian and hating the fact that now the Russians and British have attacked his country, occupied it. And so he's very upset about that, to the point where he has a German friend, Carl, in this story. And he turns to Carl at some point and says, I really hope the Germans win the war, because he sees the destruction the British and Russians, the allies, have created in Iran, his country.
Oh, wow.
And Carl, his German friend, tries to tell him, listen, before I came to Iran, I saw stuff that happened in Germany. He's talking about Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, and so forth. And his German friend is cautioning him, saying, listen, these people running the country in Germany right now are not good people. Don't
Mm.
hope that they win the war. But Sorab is so upset, and you can see why. He says, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Ah, yes.
And so we can't do anything. There's some other country that's fighting these two occupiers of my country. I want them to be defeated by that country. And so initially, that's his feeling. Towards the end of the book, he starts maturing and realizing that it's not as simple as it seems, that sometimes the enemy of your enemy is a worse person to take over.
Right, right. What is the dynamic of their relationship? Like, how do they go through this journey together?
You mean Carl and
Carl,
Sorab?
yes. Yes, I'm
Yes.
sorry. Yeah.
Well, Carl has come from Europe. So Sorab is this Iranian teenage boy, hasn't left Iran, hasn't even left Tehran that much at the point.
Mm.
And so he has a much smaller worldview. His father was very forward thinking, but dies very early. His mother was very religious and superstitious. So he has almost no connection with his mother. His mother's only looking to do religious stuff, like go to shrines and go to pilgrimages and have these religious ceremonies at home. And she's nothing like his father was to him. And so when he loses his father, he really loses his bearing. So this German family moves to Iran, the mayors, and Franz, the father of Carl, is an engineer working for the railway. And so Sorab bonds with Carl because Carl, first of all, is European. So he's teaching him so many things about the world outside of his own world. And it's fascinating for Sorab. And Carl has also never traveled to a place like the Middle East. And so Sorab has a lot of things to impart about the culture and just the country to Carl. So they have this mutually beneficial friendship relationship with each other and become best friends.
That's so interesting. What you can learn from just someone else's perspective, especially if
Right.
you've led such a sheltered kind of existence up to that point.
Right. And
Uh,
they always have they're having throughout the book, they have these back and forth discussions where Sorab keeps saying, I still want the Germans to win. I can't believe that, all that. And Carl keeps saying, no, don't be fooled. It's too complicated. It's not as easy as you think.
Yeah.
And so it's very interesting because as a teenager, I remember myself how many things I held dear and I thought so, I was so stubborn about them until later on I'd look back and go, why did I think that way? And so Rob is going through the same thing.
Yeah. Nobody wins in the war ultimately,
Nobody wins in a war, exactly.
Yeah.
Nobody.
Now, tell us a little bit about Gabriella. What is her story and how does she play into shaping Sarab's journey?
Well, that's another interesting thing that I found out through my research. So in Iran, at the time when I went to school there in high school, we had a vendor that was selling hot dogs, hamburgers, that kind of thing for the kids for lunch and dinner. We didn't have a dining area, but it was outside. It was a kiosk. And the lady manning this kiosk, we called her Madame, and she was a Polish woman. But now by that age, at the time, she was probably 50 when we
Mhm.
were kids. So she had been one of these Polish refugees that when Stalin and Hitler basically separated in their little treaty, Poland, they separated into East and West Poland, and the eastern part, Russia took over, the western part, Germany took over. And Stalin, when he took over the eastern part, anybody who was considered the intelligentsia, like university professors, writers, historians, even
Mm.
pianists, they were shipped away to Siberia
Mm.
because they wanted no organized resistance. And so many Poles were shipped to Siberia to these freezing, just bitter, basically labor camps. And so this lady that was in Iran at the time when I was a student was one of the Polish refugees that had come over as a little child. And I hadn't thought about her until I did my research and saw that 100,000 Polish refugees came to Iran and stayed. About 2,500 a day would come, and 5,000 were actually Jewish that stayed in Iran and then were able to immigrate to Israel.
Oh, wow.
And these Polish people, some of them stayed in Iran, like this lady I'm telling you about, because they loved it so much. The thing about it was that Iran at the time was going through tremendous trials where there were no food resources. And so these Polish refugees that came, the Iranians who had nothing were giving to them. And
Mm.
so they never forgot it. They always remembered. And I even read somewhere that somebody had said, my grandmother used to tell me that how wonderful it was to leave Siberia and go to Iran, which was like heaven for them at the time, even though they had nothing. And the Iranians were throwing candy at us, apples, everything, just to, welcome us to Iran.
Yeah.
And so there was this very close connection between the Poles and Iranians at the time. And so Gabriella is a character that I basically developed thinking of that lady, the Madame lady. She would have been that age and how she had survived the hardships of the Siberian prison camps. And the reason I put her in there is she is a beacon of light in terms of resilience. She had gone through so much hardship in Russia. And I'm this young kid in Tehran living kind of a more comfortable life than most people because our family was kind of shielded from the harshness of this occupation because we had contacts and we had money. And
Mhm.
so it was a little different for us. But I still, even then, felt that, oh my God, my life is so terrible until Gabriella comes and tells me about what happened to her and her family. And it opens my eyes. And I realize, yeah, even though I'm going through hardships, it's nothing like most of the people are going through. And so
Yeah.
that's what I was trying to get across through her character.
Okay. I love to hear stories like that of people that have nothing, but they give away what they have. I
Yes,
mean, it just kind of restores your faith in humanity.
exactly. Exactly.
Don't we need that? Oh.
Yes.
So we've talked some about Iran's neutrality and how that shaped your story. Were there any other significant roles that Iran played in the story as far as like their oil reserves and their
Yes. Yes.
geopolitical influence? Yeah.
Exactly. So if, geography a lot of times can be a blessing and then sometimes can be the opposite. So
Yeah.
if you have a geography that others are eyeing because of some mineral resource or some access to certain points, then that country, gets a lot of attention, attention you might not want. So Iran was that country. Iran had a warm water port on the Persian Gulf, and the British had conquered India. They called it British India.
Mm.
And so they would ship all their supplies to Egypt that they also had under control. And so the Persian Gulf was very important for them, especially that the Russians needed supplies. And the only way to get supplies to the Russians was really through this trans-Iranian railway that Reza Shah had painstakingly built, which linked the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. And so that's how they could get supplies to the Russians, because before that, the way they were getting supplies was through the North Sea, but the port of Arkhangelsk, that's in the northern part of Russia, which they would get supplies to, was now freezing because of the winter. And also, the
Mm.
German U-boats were starting to become very active and were sinking a lot of these supply convoys. And
Mm.
so they needed a safer route. And in order to take over that Trans-Iranian National Railway, the Allies had to invade Iran to take it over. And one final thing about that is that there's an oil refinery at Abadan in southern Iran, right on the Persian Gulf. So it's very easy to get the oil from that refinery and ship it out and in. And that was exactly at the time in World War II that the British changed over from using coal in their ships to oil.
Mm.
And so they really needed that oil. And at the time, back then in 1941, Iran Abadan refinery was producing 8 million barrels a day at
Oh,
that time.
wow.
And
That's
so,
amazing.
yeah, it's very amazing. And they were amazing. I mean, they were producing more than Iran produces today.
Hmm.
And the Allies were worried that Rommel was doing really well in North Africa, and he was about to come through North Africa towards Iran, and that Hitler was doing really well in the north in Russia, and they were worried he's going to come down through the Caucasus into Iran, and Rommel and the Russian soldiers from the north would meet up around Abadan, and they were worried if they lose that, they're not going to have oil to run their ships, their
Mm.
military ships, their convoys, and so forth. So Iran became very crucial to the point where the railway was called the Persian Corridor, and Iran, after the war, was called the Bridge to Victory.
Ah, wow. There's so much history. Did you at times consider just writing history or
Well, I'd been told that's what's so interesting is that a friend of mine had suggested to me, why don't you write a book on the history of Iran? And it was very interesting. The only difference is that I think people might not be as interested unless you're a history buff or studying it. I think novels are a better way to impart historical information to people rather than just a very dry history book.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, depending on the writing,
Right.
there's so much you can learn through a
Right.
historical fiction novel without
Yes.
feeling like you're being, having concepts and ideas and history and facts and all beat into you, like a textbook
Exactly.
would. So, yeah.
Yes. The way I wrote the book, I was able to, through either radio broadcasts or newspaper articles or something like that, impart a lot of the historical information that way.
Yeah. Let's talk about your writing a little bit. You, of course, explore many themes in your book: love, loss, resilience. The story is rich in emotional depth. How did you balance like the harsh realities of war with the more tender moments and just still giving readers this hope,
Yes. Well, so, I don't know how other writers write. I mean, I hear how they say they write. The way I write is I basically visualize it like a movie in my head before
Hmm.
I even start to write. So it's almost like I'm writing a movie script. So I think to myself, okay, so if I'm going to be standing there and saying this to that person, how is that person reacting at the time? That's how I keep myself from making it not sounding fake. If you think to yourself, like if I say this to a certain
Mm.
person and then they respond a certain way. It's got to be realistic. If you hear an answer by another character that, doesn't make sense, then the whole story starts not sounding like it makes sense. And so that's how I did it. I
Right.
was writing it when I was talking about Gabriella, for example. I was trying to remember my first love, or my first time when there was a woman that I noticed, because that's what happens with Sohrab. It's like a first person that's around his age that he starts having feelings for. And of course, Gabriella doesn't seem interested. But so I went back into, like, when I was in high school, when I would feel that way, how would that feel? And that's how I started writing that part. And in the war parts, so a lot happens through watching movies and reading other kind of books and listening to stories of war. But again, I tried to imagine how it would be if I was in the middle of this place that just got bombed out and I'm walking and they're showing it to me. How would I feel? Would I feel like dejected, or would I feel angry? And so in this case, Sohrab, when he is walking around seeing all the Allies had, used their planes to first drop flyers that basically warned us in Iran at the time to, be careful. The Germans are coming. They're going to try to conquer you. We're here to save you.
Mm.
And Sohrab is like, save us from who? From the Germans who are building our country, from my own sister-in-law that's German and I love her, from my own best friend Carl who's German and I love him. What are the Allies saying? And then a few minutes later, the pamphlets or the flyers are replaced by actual bombs. I mean, they didn't even give them enough time. It's like saying, leave, we're going to bomb it. And then they bomb it like 10 seconds later. And, that kind of thing. It's kind of like, so what was the use of those pamphlets? Just to say we warned, but it really was no warning.
Right.
And so I
Wow.
tried to put myself in those positions and see how I would feel. I would feel very upset. And you can see why Sohrab wants the Germans to win, because there's no guarantees even in their pamphlets, these allies. So why should I believe anything they're saying?
Right. Well, I like how you do that, just initially starting out with a picture in your mind, a movie,
Right.
to make it feel authentic and genuine. And I think the same for dialogue. You can't just write it on a page and it's done. I mean, actually say it out loud and see if it sounds authentic. Because
Exactly. And what's very interesting is that I'm just having the audiobook done because it took a long time for me to find somebody that could really capture all these different characters and their voices. And finally, I found a great narrator, Dustin Naylor, who's done a great job because he does German accents, Russian accents, British accents, and you have a lot of these characters in the book. When I heard him, read what I had written, it felt better to me than when I was reading my own writing.
Oh,
It's
wow,
like,
yeah. Well, I love audiobooks and some of the audio actors, they are magnificent, and I
yeah,
feel like they can really make or break the audiobook for
yes,
sure.
exactly.
So I'm glad you took your time and found the right person, and I'm actually interested in listening to that, so I'll be looking it up for
Yeah.
sure, yeah. What kind of feedback have you received from readers so far?
Well, what's very interesting is that because my first book was a romance type book, it became very popular. I think even more popular maybe than World War II fiction,
Mm,
either because World War II is too far away, maybe, or romance, it's easier to digest. But the feedback I've gotten has mostly been from people who knew nothing about this invasion and occupation of Iran, that for 4 years they were invaded and occupied and knew nothing about even Iranians. Uh, I've done some interviews for the book launch. We went up to Toronto and did a book launch there. And the gentleman that was asking the questions was telling me that, I'm a history and poli sci major, and I'm a history buff. And nowhere did I hear that millions of Iranians died in World War II. And
oh,
so he
wow.
asked the audience, it was in front of a live audience, like 50 people. And he said, how many knew? And only like one or two people raised their hands and didn't even know it as in much detail as I've written. So I think the feedback I've gotten is that people are very grateful that I've done this because it's an untold chapter of World War II history that transcends the typical boundaries of historical fiction, in that there's a lot of fact in it, but
Hmm.
also there's a lot of fact that nobody seems to have known,
Yeah. Yeah.
except,
That is so validating. And to me, it just says, wow, you hit it on the head because this was a story that needed to be told, you know?
well, it just won the E.M. Forster Gold Medal for historical fiction, so I'm very happy about that.
Oh, wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Now, you mentioned earlier when we were talking about research that you
Yeah.
had enough to make it a much longer book, but you
Yeah.
didn't. And I feel like that was a good decision. But do you plan on expanding this story anymore? Or are you done with this story? Or what's next
Well,
for you?
when the reader reads it, they'll see the end of it ends with the character Sohrab going to the United States to study. And so there is more of the story in the United States and going back to Iran later after the war. I left it open ended because I did think that maybe I could write another book, the third in, it's not a trilogy because my first one had nothing to do with this. But the first
Right.
one was World War One era. This is World War Two era, and then this would be the post-war era. But I haven't done that yet because I'm also a musician, and now I'm planning to go back and do a few recordings, music recordings with my musical partner Shaheen. We have a band, Shaheen and Sepehr, and so I've put that aside for a while to be able to write these books. But now I want to kind of go back into the music a little bit. So I
Oh,
don't know
yeah.
when that third one will be written. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, you give this one time and time for the audiobook to take off. And so,
Yes.
yeah, wonderful. Wonderful. Well, Sapir, did you have anything you wanted to add today?
Yes, just one thing in addition to the response I gave to you about what the feedback is that, a lot of people, when they think about Iran, of course, nowadays, Iran, it's in the news a lot, not for good reasons, unfortunately.
Hmm.
But, a lot of people think Iran's animus towards the West was because of 1953 when Mossadegh, which was the prime minister of Iran, was basically overthrown by what people think foreign, the British and the Americans and so forth. And
Hmm.
then the Shah was installed. Some don't believe that happened. Some believe it was truly a national movement to bring the Shah back. Some believe that no, it was the intelligence services of America and England that removed Mossadegh. And so that's what they always point to when they say that's why Iranians don't trust the West and so forth. My theory is that it even goes further back because Mossadegh, the prime minister, was in 1953. This occupation was in 1941. And I think an occupation, an invasion, which killed a quarter of your people, and they took all your food and sent it up to the Russians, that can create more of an animus. And they actually got rid of Reza Shah. So the Allies came and said Reza Shah's got to go into exile. So they even removed the actual king, not even a prime minister at the time. So
Mm.
my belief is that there's kind of like how people can have post-traumatic stress, say a military person and goes to a war and comes back and has that. Well, a nation can have that too.
Oh,
And I
yeah.
think that's what happened with the nation that culminated in this whole revolution, where unfortunately today the country's not doing too well. But it was a country when I lived there in the 70s that was ascendant and would have been, if this revolution hadn't happened, probably a South Korea or Japan of the Middle East.
Mm. Wow. Well, Sapir, thank you so much for joining me
Thank
today.
you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining me today for my interview with Sepehr Haddad, author of The Harmless Necessary Cat. To learn more about Sepehr Haddad and his work, visit his website at sepehrhaddad.com and be sure to check out our other interviews at InsideScoopLive.com.